The morning Violet Prewett took on a hired hand. She had exactly 4 shillings left to her name, a broken sluice gate, and no patience whatsoever for the man standing at her door with mud on his boots and nothing in his pockets. She had not advertised. She hadn't the money for a notice in the paper, and the truth was she'd been hoping, in the quiet, stubborn way she hoped for most things, that she wouldn't need to ask anyone for help at all. The tannery had been her father's before it was hers, and his father's before that, and 3 generations of Prewetts had managed the vats and the bark and the stench of the place, without begging strangers off the road. But the sluice gate had split clean through in the freeze last February, and now it was April, and the water wasn't moving right, and if she didn't get production back up before the summer orders came due, she would lose the Alderton contract, and without the Alderton contract, she would lose everything else besides. So when the man knocked, she answered. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected, not having expected anyone at all. Dark hair, unwashed. A coat that had seen better years, possibly better decades. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her steadily, which was more than most men managed when faced with a woman who answered her own door at a tannery. "I heard you might have work," he said. Violet looked him over. "Who told you that?" "The woman at the post office. She said your sluice needed fixing and your bark press was running short-handed." Mrs. Calloway at the post office had said no such thing to any stranger on Violet's behalf. Violet was quite sure of that. But the post office was where people talked, and people talked because the tannery's troubles were not precisely a secret in the village of Ashwick. "Do you know anything about tanning?" she asked. "I know how a sluice gate works," he said, "and I'm good with my hands." That wasn't an answer to her question. She noticed that he noticed that she noticed. His expression didn't change. "What's your name?" "Marsh," he said. "Edmund Marsh." She didn't recognize the name. That was neither here nor there. Plenty of men drifted through the valley looking for seasonal work, following the farms or the timber operations, or apparently the tanneries. She studied him a moment longer. He was lean but not hungry-looking. His hands, when she glanced at them, were calloused. Real calluses, not the soft pink kind that came from 1 week of outdoor work. "I pay a fair wage," she said. "Not a generous one. Room in the outbuilding, meals twice a day. The work is hard, and the smell is worse." "I've smelled worse," he said. She very much doubted that, but she stepped back from the door and let him in. That first week, she watched him more than she should have. It wasn't distrust, exactly, or not only distrust. It was the kind of watching you did when something didn't quite add up, and you were trying to figure out which piece was wrong. Edmund Marsh worked. He worked without being told what to do next, which was unusual. Most hired men needed directing every hour. Edmund would finish one task and move directly to the next logical one, as if he'd read the tannery like a book and understood its rhythms after a single afternoon. He fixed the sluice gate in 2 days. She'd had a carpenter out in March who'd looked at it for an hour and told her she needed to order parts from Halifax. Edmund looked at it for 20 minutes, disappeared into the workshop, and came back with a solution made from materials she already had on hand. The repair held. The water moved properly for the first time since February. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked him that second evening. They were eating at the kitchen table. She had not intended for meals to be a shared affair, but the outbuilding had no proper table, only a workbench, and it seemed unkind to make a man eat standing up. He looked up from his bowl. "My family had a mill," he said. "Growing up. Water systems were a concern." "Past tense," she said. "The mill, past tense," he agreed, and went back to his soup. She didn't push. It wasn't her business. Everyone had a past tense somewhere. What she did notice, over the weeks that followed, was that Edmund Marsh read Latin. She discovered this on a rainy Thursday when she came into the workshop to find him holding one of her father's old technical manuals, a German translation of a Roman agricultural text that had been sitting decoratively on the shelf for 30 years, because no one in the family had ever been able to read it. He was reading it, not looking at it, reading it. He set it down when she came in, said nothing about it. She said nothing either, but she thought about it. She thought about the way he spoke, careful, and even not the accent of the valley, not quite any accent she could place precisely. She thought about his hands, which were calloused but also fine-boned, the hands of someone who had come to labour later in life rather than being born to it. She thought about the way he occasionally caught himself about to say something, and then didn't say it, a small hesitation that happened most often when she asked him about himself. Ashwick was a small village. People talked. By the third week, 3 separate neighbours had found reasons to stop by the tannery, ostensibly about other things, actually to look at Edmund. He was polite to all of them. He answered questions directly and briefly, and gave them very little to take home with them. "People are curious about you," Violet told him one evening. "People are curious about everything in small places," he said. "Are you going to tell me anything useful about where you came from?" He looked at her, one of those steady level looks she'd grown accustomed to. "I came from the south. I needed work. I found some." "That's not useful," she said. "That's the bare minimum of information." Something flickered in his face. Almost amusement. "You're very direct, Miss Prewett." "I run a tannery alone at 28, she said. The almost amusement became something she couldn't name, something that sat between admiration and a kind of careful sorrow. He looked away first, which he rarely did. "I'm not hiding anything that should concern you," he said quietly. "I promise you that." It was a strange thing to promise. It was also, she found, enough for the moment. Spring moved into early summer. The Alderton contract held. She hired a second man, young Will Soper from the village, to help with the bark processing, and watched how Edmund fell easily into showing the boy the work, without ever making it seem like he was in charge when he wasn't. He managed the dynamics so naturally that it was only later she realised he'd done it at all. They developed a habit, she and Edmund, of talking in the evenings after the work was done. Not long conversations. She was too tired for slong, and he seemed to understand that. But real ones. He asked about her father who died 3 winters ago. She asked about his family, and he gave her pieces that felt like pieces. A brother somewhere south, an estate he'd stepped away from. He said it like estate meant burden, not inheritance. "Why?" she asked once. "Why step away?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the yard where the last light was going gold on the drying racks. "I wanted to know what I could do," he said, "without any of it, whether I was anything on my own." She understood that more than she'd expected to. She thought of the months after her father's death, when people had told her she ought to sell, when she'd needed to know whether she could keep it going, not because the money made sense, but because she needed to know if she was capable of it. "And," she said. "I think I'm finding out," he said, and the way he looked at her, then made her look at her hands. She was not naive. She knew what was happening between them. The slow, careful accumulation of it. The way she noticed when he wasn't in the yard, and didn't notice when Will Soper wasn't. She knew it was foolish. He was a hired man, and she was his employer, and she had a tannery to run and no appetite for complications. She told herself all of this with great conviction. She did not entirely believe herself. It was Mrs. Calloway who broke it. Of course it was Mrs. Calloway. The woman at the post office knew everything, always had, and what she didn't know she found out by reading the return addresses on letters. There had been a letter. Violet didn't know about the letter until after, when Mrs. Calloway mentioned, over casually, that she'd had quite an interesting piece of post come through, addressed to one Mr. E. Marsh at the Prewett Tannery, but with the sender's address being Dunmore House, Wiltshire, and the sender being styled, rather formally, as Lord Cavendish Royal. Violet's face did something she wasn't proud of. "I thought it might interest you," Mrs. Calloway said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been holding a secret and could now no longer justify keeping it. She didn't say anything to Edmund that evening. She thought about it all night, sorting through what she knew and what it meant, fitting pieces together with the cold, efficient part of her mind that she used for accounts. Edmund Marsh. Dunmore House. Lord Cavendish Royal. She knew the name. Not personally, she had no reason to know it personally. But the Cavendish royal family were old money, old title, the kind of family that had a county named after a subsidiary landholding. The eldest son and heir held the Marquessate of Dunmore. She lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the yard, and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It came to her around 3 in the morning, when the owls were quiet. It was grief. Not the grief of loss exactly. The grief of a thing that had been growing in her, unnamed and tended carefully in the dark, and had just been told what it was and what it couldn't be in the same moment. She called him Edmund in her head. She had thought he was Edmund. He had been Edmund. He just happened to also be the Marquess of Dunmore. She went about the next day normally. She was very good at normally. She checked the vats, talked to Will Soper about the drying schedule, wrote two letters to suppliers and one to the Alderton steward about their autumn order. She was precise and efficient, and she did not look at Edmund any differently than she had yesterday, or she tried not to. He came to find her mid-afternoon. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. She was at the ledger desk, and she kept her eyes on the page for just a moment before she looked up. "Mrs. Calloway is constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret that interesting." He sat down across from her, which he'd never done without being invited. His elbows were on his knees, and he was looking at her with an expression that was the most unguarded she'd ever seen on him. Stripped of the careful steadiness, just a man who was waiting to find out what someone thought of him. "I should have told you," he said. "I know that." "Yes," she said. "You should have. I didn't because—" He stopped, started again. "When people know, it changes everything. How they act, what they say. I hadn't been treated like an ordinary man I couldn't tell you when, and I wanted to know if I could do the work. Real work, not the management of other people doing work, but the actual thing." "You proved that," she said. "I proved it to myself," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you giving me the chance. You deceived me." "I withheld something," he said. "I know it's the same thing." She appreciated that he didn't argue the point. It would have been easy to argue it, and the fact that he didn't made the knot in her chest pull tighter. "What do you want from me?" she said. "What is it that you're asking for here?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not sure I'm in a position to ask for anything," he said. "I think I'm in a position where I owe you an honest accounting of what I've done and why, and then the next move is yours." Violet stood up from the desk. She went to the window that looked out over the drying yard, the same window her father had stood at for 30 years, checking the racks, checking the sky, measuring the weather. She put her hand on the frame. "A marquess," she said. "You have an estate in Wiltshire." "I do. Staff, tenants, responsibilities that I can't imagine." "Yes, and you've been sleeping in my outbuilding and eating soup at my kitchen table for 2 months. There was a pause. "The soup is very good," he said. She turned around. He was watching her with that unguarded look still on his face, and she thought, "This is the man who fixed my sluice gate with what he found in the workshop. This is the man who read my father's Latin manual and didn't mention it. This is the man who told Will Soper what he needed to know without making the boy feel small. She had not invented that. Whatever he'd withheld, she had not invented that. "I need to think," she said. "Of course. I mean, I need time. Real time, not a conversation. I understand." He stood. The East Vats need checking tonight. I'll see to them." "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was direct, because she hadn't the time or patience for otherwise, "Edmund, this isn't finished." He stopped at the door. His back was to her, and she watched his shoulders settle slightly. "I know," he said. "I'll be here." The thinking took 3 days. She let it take 3 days because she was not a woman who made important decisions quickly just to get them over with, and because this was the most important decision she'd been faced with since she'd chosen to keep the tannery. She thought about what she actually knew of him, separate from what she'd assumed. She thought about the letter from Dunmore House, what it meant that he'd been there long enough for letters to find him, what it meant that he hadn't gone back. She thought about what he'd said. "I wanted to know what I could do without any of it." She thought about whether she trusted that, and she decided that she did, not because she was naive, but because she'd watched him for 2 months, and naive wasn't a word that applied to her. She thought about the Marquessate, the estate in Wiltshire, the life that went with it. She thought about whether she could fit into that life, and she thought, probably not in the way that word usually meant. She wasn't going to become a marchioness in any sense that the word implied. She didn't know how to be that, and she didn't particularly want to learn, and she thought that anyone who expected it of her was going to be disappointed. But she also thought about what he'd said about the next move being hers, and she thought that a man who understood that was not nothing. On the third evening, she found him at the East Vats. He'd been checking them every night, as he'd said, which she'd noticed and not mentioned. She stood beside him for a moment, looking at the water, which was moving correctly, and had been moving correctly since February, since a man with calloused, fine-boned hands had spent 2 days figuring out how to fix it with what was available. "I have questions," she said. He turned to look at her. The unguarded expression was back. "All right, your life in Wiltshire, the estate, the title, whatever it involves, that's yours. I'm not asking you to set it down." "I know you're not," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to ask that, but I'm not going to move there and learn to be a marchioness. I don't know how to do that, and I don't think I'd be good at it, and I think it would make both of us miserable." "Violet, I'm not finished," she said. "I have a tannery. It was my father's and his father's before that, and I kept it going when everyone said I couldn't, and I'm not going to hand it over to a manager and go live in a house with 50 rooms, because that's what a marquess's wife is supposed to do." He was quiet. She'd expected an argument, some form of it, some reasonable presentation of why she was being unreasonable. He didn't give her one. "I know who you are," he said. "I've known since the first week. I'm not asking you to become someone else. Then what are you asking?" He turned to face her fully. The last of the light was behind him, and the yard smelled the way it always did, the particular earthen chemical smell that she'd grown up with and now couldn't imagine being without. "I'm asking whether you'd be willing to work out, together, what it looks like," he said. "2 lives that are both real. Not you folding into mine or me folding into yours, something that's its own thing." She looked at him for a long time. "That sounds complicated," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "It sounds like a negotiation that's going to take years. Very likely. You fixed my sluice gate," she said, "with what you found in the workshop." A small smile. The real one, not the careful version. "I did. If this is harder than that, it will be harder than that," he said. "But I'm good at working with what's available." She looked away first this time. Out across the yard, the racks, the roof of the building her grandfather had built. She thought about her father standing at the window checking the weather. She thought about what it meant to keep something going. "Ask me properly," she said, not looking at him. A pause. Then she heard him move, and she turned, and he was closer than she'd expected. Not reaching for her hand, just close, looking at her with all of that steadiness and all of that openness at once. "Violet Prewett," he said. "Will you take a chance on this being workable?" It was the least romantic proposal she had ever heard. She had not thought about proposals much, generally, but she was fairly certain most of them did not involve the word workable. She looked at him. "You'll have to come to Ashwick," she said. "Part of the year, at minimum. I've been coming to Ashwick," he pointed out. "You'll have to tell people who you are. I won't have secrets in my yard, fair. And you'll have to teach me the Latin manual. I've wanted to read it for 15 years. Something shifted in his face, a warmth that she had seen before and hadn't been able to name and now didn't need to. "I'll teach you the Latin," he said. "All right," she said. "Then yes." It wasn't simple after that. She hadn't expected it to be, and it wasn't. There was the matter of Dunmore House, which required him back in Wiltshire for the better part of July. And there was the matter of the Alderton contract autumn extension, which required her full attention through August. And there was the matter of his family. A mother who was dignified about it, and a younger brother who was less dignified, and an estate steward who wrote to her directly to inquire about her plans for the tannery, which she found impertinent enough to answer in considerable detail. She did not give up the tannery. She had never considered giving up the tannery. She had hired a permanent second man the following spring when production warranted it. And she took on an apprentice the spring after that, and the tannery that had been her grandfather's and her father's became, without fanfare, the kind of business that outlasted the people who ran it. She went to Dunmore House for the first time that November, when the harvest was in and the tannery could spare her for a fortnight. She stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the ceiling, which was painted, and at the staircase, which was the width of her whole ground floor, and thought quite calmly that this was a great deal of house. Edmund stood beside her. He'd been watching her face. "Too much," he said. "Quite a lot," she said. "You get used to it." "I doubt that," she said, "but I'll see." She learned, eventually, not which rooms to use or how to speak to the staff. She managed that easily enough. She was good with people when she chose to be. But how to be herself inside it, that was the harder thing. To walk through rooms that were built for a different kind of woman and not feel herself reshaping to fit them. To be called my lady by the housekeeper and not flinch or correct the woman, to accept it as one name among several she went by. In Ashwick, she was Violet, or Miss Prewett, or the tanner's daughter, or the woman who kept the tannery going. In Wiltshire, she was the Marquess of Dunmore, which was a title she wore the way she wore good boots. Functional, properly fitted after some breaking in. Not quite the same as going barefoot, but useful for the terrain. Edmund called her Violet. That had not changed. There was a morning, the second winter, when she came downstairs at Dunmore House, before he was up, and found the estate steward. The same one who'd written to her impertinently about her plans, waiting in the study with a problem about the lower pasture drainage. She listened to the problem. She asked 3 questions. She looked at the survey map he'd brought. She told him what she thought the solution was. He stared at her. Water management, she said, and she might have smiled slightly, is a concern I've had some experience with. He took her advice. The drainage problem was resolved by spring. After that, the steward stopped writing to ask what her plans were, and started writing to ask what she thought. Edmund found this funny. She didn't particularly, but she let him find it funny because she found other things funny that he was good-natured enough to tolerate. They were, she had decided, a workable arrangement. Not in the small dry way that word had sounded the night he proposed it, standing beside the east vats with the last of the light behind him. Workable, she had come to understand, was not the opposite of feeling. Workable was what feeling became when it had enough time and honesty, and 2 people who were both too stubborn to pretend to be something they weren't. She still went to the tannery in the mornings when she was in Ashwick. She still checked the vats and the water and the bark supply, still talked through the week's schedule with her foreman, still came in at midday with the particular smell of the work on her coat that no amount of airing quite removed. Edmund had stopped noticing the smell, or said he had. She thought he was probably telling the truth. A man who'd spent 4 months working in a tannery didn't get to be precious about it afterwards. Her grandfather's ledger books were still on the shelf in the office. Her father's Latin manual was on a different shelf now, in a different building in a different county, spine cracked from use, with 2 people's handwriting in the margins, hers neater, his larger, occasionally arguing with each other, across the space of a century-old page about what the original text actually meant. She had not become a marchioness in the way anyone had expected. She had not become anything other than what she was. What she was turned out to be more than enough. For the tannery, for Dunmore House, for the man who had shown up at her door with mud on his boots, nothing in his pockets, and turned out to own half of Wiltshire. She had hired him because she was desperate, and he could fix a sluice gate. She kept him because he had never, not once, asked her to be smaller than she was.